Hello and welcome to Bright Wings, children's books to make the heart soar. I am your host, Charity Hill. The purpose of this conversation is to help mothers and fathers identify books that will liberate their children to embrace truth, goodness, and beauty. I think everyone listening to this podcast, every mother, father, grandparent, or teacher listening to this podcast has probably gone through a stage in their life where they've been obsessed with World War II fiction. Maybe it feels like a weird thing to admit, but I don't think it's too weird. I mean, maybe it feels like a weird thing because you don't want to be obsessed with war or death or atrocities. Certainly not. However, I think probably the interest comes from something a lot deeper than that. Within the past few months, I have read quite a number of World War II related fictional works. And I think if there is a genre that's overall pretty excellent, maybe it's World War II fiction. Like as a whole genre, I'm really kind of impressed with almost every picture book and novel that I pick up on the topic. And I began to ask myself, why is that? Why is the literature on this topic so good? It's such a terrible time. I thought, well, maybe that it's because we have to do a good job because the topic is so challenging. Now, overall, what I think defines the good fiction related to World War II is that what's going on with World War II fiction is that it's clear what's at stake. Good and evil are clearly defined. There are sides, right? That also helps. Kids like the clarity that there are two distinct sides to the problem. World War II fiction also has an opportunity to be nuanced, to be textured. I think what's good about World War II fiction is that it's personalized because it's telling a story. It's particular and specific and situational. And this is what also helps to give nuance and texture. And this is why I prefer introducing the situations of World War II to my children through fiction, actually, rather than nonfiction, is because it can be nuanced and textured, precisely because it's fiction. Just very, very obviously, a character in a story is not bearing the reality of all the people in all of the atrocious situations of all of World War II. I think if a child approaches the situations of World War II through nonfiction, I think that can feel really overwhelming. Sometimes with nonfiction, this is what it feels like, is we as a reader are bearing the big picture horror of it. And so that's why I appreciate approaching World War II through fiction. There we can focus on the specific and the relational and the ethical situation of one particular character or family. And so we too can realize I bear my suffering. I bear out my situation. And yeah, so that's why I think fiction is an easier entry point than nonfiction. And so why did we like it growing up? And why do our kids like it? Why are our children interested in this era? Gosh, I have so many thoughts on this. You know, I was probably about 40 when I realized that when I was growing up in the early 80s, World War II was only 40 years away from me. I only had the distance of like one middle-aged person away from World War II. It was just recently that I realized like they had nail polish and toasters and atom bombs and concentration camps. They had phones and cars and lipstick and genocide. It was such a shock to realize that it wasn't very long ago. Of course, when you're 40 years ago seems a long time ago. Hard to think about so long ago. But as a 40-ish person myself, I realized 40 years ago is not long ago. Maybe that was a rabbit trail, but I just want to situate this for us, I guess. What I wanted to say about why do we like this era? Why does it appeal to our children? Why did we like it growing up? Of course, one of the obvious features is that children are kind of interested in violence as long as they're not suffering it, I think. I'll never forget reading the children's Bible to my eldest daughter, and I remember her bringing it back to me the next day, and she hands me the children's Bible, and she says, with her sweet little face, her cute little voice, "Can you read to me something where someone gets killed?" so shocking. But I think there's more than just a fascination with violence. I think children want to know the structure of reality. They want to know about ultimate things. They want to know about what's at stake. And so I think interest in World War II related literature is a concern in our children about good and evil, about life and death. And they want to press into these realities. Children want to know, what is justice? What would it be like? What good must I do? Would I be brave? How many of you asked yourselves, what would I do? How would I have responded? Our children want to know, is death the worst thing that can happen to me? Or is there something worse? By the time they're curious about World War II literature, they're already aware that actions and choices have consequences. And in World War II literature, we see that being a child doesn't exempt you from suffering adults' decisions. And I think children have already tasted that in a small scale, let's hope, in their own life already. We see in so many of these novels how being a child didn't exempt them from deadly serious actions that they had to take to preserve their life or their family's life or a person from their community. I think children, especially boys, want to know, do I have what it takes? Would I have what it takes? Should children be recruited as soldiers? No. As message bearers, facilitators, secret keepers? I think fiction related to World War II makes us wonder, when everything's at stake, life, death, truth, lies, propaganda, human dignity versus exploitation, perhaps it's impossible that children remain unscathed and uninvolved. World War II fiction helps children, I think, consider, is there an evil I should oppose with all my strength and my life? Is there something worse than death, like I said earlier, that I could suffer? Is it better to die than to save my life by becoming evil? I think that is the biggest question that prods at us, even as we're children, even as we're 8 and 12 years old, reading these stories and novels. But it's not just the huge, gigantic question, right? World War II literature poses smaller questions that children crave an answer to. And really, I feel like this literature asks our children about such interior questions about their own hearts and their own character. I think that's why we're drawn to it. I think the questions that our children ask themselves through this literature is, could I be brave? Could I be trusted? Would I have been trustworthy? Could I handle being hungry and cold, tired, afraid? Which side would I have been on? Would I have given in to enormous social pressure or not? What kind of influences would have kept me true? Now, there are a whole range of picture books in the World War II category, from very gentle to much more challenging to read. But I would say almost every picture book in this category fulfills what a picture book should be, often to a wonderful and high degree. All the art in the books on the book list for these picture books is excellent. All very different from each other, though, but beautiful. And it's very possible to read a picture book on this topic to your child and it not be a damaging experience, but an important one. The most gentle book on this topic that I have found is titled Stone Angel by Jane Yolen. A little girl and her family are forced to wear the yellow star. But the little girl doesn't mind because, according to her way of thinking, where there are stars, there are angels. They have to flee their home in Paris and they hide in the woods. And she trusts that even in the woods, the angels are watching over them. When they flee France and take refuge in England, she believes even then that the angels have their eyes upon them. And as the book ends, the girl and her family return to Paris. And at the apartment building that is lined up for them to live in, what is outside but a gigantic architectural stone angel is welcoming them back. Despite how cheerful I've made the book sound, there is a quality of bleakness to it that is possible to either perceive or not perceive depending on your sensitivity. For example, when the baker refuses to sell them croissants, her mother cries and says, "They're not bad people, they're just afraid." And the background information of the family hiding out in the woods for a while, they were with resistance fighters. And so there's information to be gleaned from these pages that's subtle if you're looking for more. Or you can just leave it simply and quietly the way that it is. It's a really lovely book. Now, there's another story that's actually and apparently quite lovelier and lighter, except for the tense moment in the book. This one is called The Lily Cupboard by Shulamith Levi Oppenheim. It's illustrated by Ronald Himmler, who interestingly has done a number of illustrations for books of historical fiction, other picture books that are historical fiction. I like him. In the Lily Cupboard, a little girl named Miriam is relocated to the countryside of Holland with a Gentile family to be hidden from the Nazi occupiers. They have a secret cupboard where they practice hiding her. You get the impression that she's very little, but they dote on her. They give her, I believe, a kitten to play with that she loves. And one day, as she's playing with the kitten out in the garden, she gets the notification that she needs to run into the house and hide in the cupboard. And her kitten gets away from her, and she wants to have her kitten with her as she hides. So they barely make it in time, and she's quiet in the cupboard. And finally, the bad men go away. Wait a sec, it's a rabbit, not a kitten. I was thinking, what would happen if that kitten meowed? That'd be terrible. It's a rabbit, which doesn't make any sound. But it's tense in this moment because as a mother, you wonder, would my child make a sound? Would they come when I called them? Would they come when I needed to hide them? Or would everything be lost? Most of the children that you'd be reading this book to would be older than the little girl in the story, Miriam. And they'd be wiser about how she needs to participate and how she needs to act in order to be safe. It's a very sensitively accomplished book. A book that I thought was going to be a lot harder to read than it is a book called The Harmonica, written by Tony Johnston and illustrated by Ron Mazzellin. Now, I shouldn't have worried because Tony Johnston is a master storyteller, but the colors of the artwork are so harsh that you're thinking Schindler's List the whole time. But ultimately, it's beautiful. Quite stunningly, it's based on a true story of a boy who was separated from his parents. They were sent to one concentration camp and he to another. And he was able to keep with him his harmonica. And he would play his music to console the people in his bunkhouse. And it brings back his memories of his parents and his family. Both fortunately and unfortunately, the camp commandant finds out about his ability to play the harmonica. And he insists and forces him to play for him Schubert. The book says something like, though the commandant could wear cruelty like a cloak, he also loved Schubert. He also loved beauty. And after he would play, the boy would be given bread, and he feels guilt at receiving bread while the others starve to death. So the boy is full of guilt about this until one night he discovers that the other prisoners can hear him playing Schubert, and they're grateful. They're grateful for his music. And so night after night, while he plays for the commandant, he plays for his fellow prisoners to lift them. I would consider the first two picture books to be on the most gentle end, and then the harmonica to be on the harshest end of kind of picture books from this genre. Let me tell you about one that sits somewhere in between. It's an extended picture book called Mr. Doctor, Janusz Korczak and the Orphans of the Warsaw Ghetto. He was a man analogous to William Sears in terms of his national stature. He wrote works for children. He wrote parenting books for adults. He had theories about treating children with love and respect. He ran an orphanage with a team of other adults in which there was some self-governing of the children by the children. They had duties and responsibilities and rights within their orphanage. He created a world of beauty and love and respect. And when all the Jews in Warsaw were put into the ghetto, people were dying often and leaving behind their children. And so his orphanage continued to be filled with ever more children. Finally, even though he was given the chance to escape, given false identity papers so that he could get away, he in the end decided to go along with his children and protect them all the way through to the end, to see them through to the end. They were forced onto trains to go to Treblinka and certain death. But your heart just swells with the powerful goodness of this man, of his faithfulness to these children. The architecture, the beautifully drawn figures, there's the illustrations are slightly monochromatic, but they're so well done. They depict the affection and the fidelity, the bleakness, the desperation, and the goodness that's wrapped up in this pediatrician's life, Janusz Korczak. This man was a new name to me and really a figure of hope during his time. So this would be a marvelous book for an older child, 8, 9, 10, 11 years old. If your child is doing a project at school related to World War II, or if you're studying this era in your homeschool, Korczak's life and work is really an inspiration, really a figure of light amidst darkness. I am starting to feel heavy in the middle of this podcast. Let me just reiterate something that I have said before in other podcasts, which is not every book is for every child. So if this entire genre is not something you want to touch in your family, that's fine. Thank you for listening to this podcast. Anyway, let me reiterate that I appreciate this genre because I feel like this whole genre of literature is a witness that a light can shine in the darkness, and the darkness does not overcome it. So even though the topic that we're talking about is very heavy, it thereby also has the potential to show us great goodness and be a source of great hope and joy. Joy from out of the depths, because personal and institutional evil cannot conquer goodness, as fragile as it seems. Joy because there is such a thing as heroic virtue. All right, so I just convinced myself to keep going. And next, I want to talk about middle grade fiction, middle grade novels. An often overlooked book is called 20 in 10, a title written by Claire Hutchett Bishop. It concerns 20 French school children who've been relocated to the countryside during World War II. They're looked after by 2 religious sisters, nuns, who are their teachers. Though food and space to sleep is somewhat hard to come by, the sisters ask the children to help them hide 10 Jewish school children. As this short novel opens, the children are playing one of their favorite games. They're playing Flight into Egypt, in which they act out the events where Mary and Joseph take the baby Jesus and flee from Herod, who wants to kill them, and go and hide as refugees in Egypt. This device has everything to do with how the children respond to the tense situation that they're put in, the way that they welcome the other school children, the Jewish school children, and the way that they hide them. Such a good book. As far as middle grade novels go, I think this is just such a great beginner novel introducing this whole topic. It is very gentle overall. Also, there's a similarly gentle book, but written much more recently, called The Bicycle Spy by Jonna Zeldas McDonough. In this story, a boy who loves the Tour de France, who loves cycling. He's the son of bakers who are working in the French resistance. They're hiding messages he discovers in the bread that his parents are asking him to deliver. These messages help people transport Jewish families into safety. Marcel discovers that a friend of his needs to be taken to safety, and he has to use all his strength and courage and all his skills at cycling to do what he can to get her and her family to safety. It's full of really wonderful tidbits about French culture and French food. So this is especially beautiful book and very accessible. I let my son, who was I think 7 at the time, listen to this on audiobook, and then we read it aloud, and he read part of it to himself as an 8-year-old. Briefly, I want to mention the author Shirley Hughes, who you might know from the Alfie and Rosie books, Alfie Gets In First, and all those wonderfully charming picture books. Shirley Hughes wrote quite a number of World War II related fiction. One is called Whistling in the Dark, and another one is called A Hero on a Bicycle. And this one is also another cycling book set in Italy, this time with the Italian resistance. I put them on our book list, but I want to tell you, I haven't read them. I just trust Shirley Hughes. I'm in the process of ordering them, and I will take them off the book list if I think that they're not worthy of you and your children. This next book is a story about World War II that is rarely told. In this case, it's a true story. It's an autobiographical story by Esther Hautzig called The Endless Steppe. She tells us how her family from Vilna, Poland, was forcibly deported to Siberia by the Communist Soviets in 1941 for the crime of being capitalists. This Jewish family, who was fairly well-to-do, manifests just incredible amounts of resilience in the face of incredible deprivation and hardship. I think I was like cold the entire time I read this story. I'm always so impressed when parents in these really terrible circumstances continue to be cheerful with their children. And especially in this story, Esther's father plays such a beautiful role of strengthening and encouraging her. The witness of her zesty grandmother in the circumstances as well is delightful and impressive. She reports to us some staggering moments, such as her father is drafted by the Russians to fight the Germans. She reports how captured German soldiers were sent as prisoners to her town in Siberia and how they all hated them and how they seemed to hate themselves, and how when everyone was living in such deprived circumstances, these German captives received even less. And she tells us at the end how being deported to Siberia was not the worst thing that could have happened to them, because in fact, it saved their lives, because their family left behind in Vilna, Poland, they all died in concentration camps. So I greatly appreciate The Endless Steppe by Esther Hautzig because it tells aspects of the story of World War II that are more rarely heard. This next book really impresses me because it asks and deals with questions we don't think about asking. Questions such as, what happened over there after we left? Well, says the American. The title of this book is called The Ark by Margot Bennery-Isbert, and it concerns what was going on in Germany after the war. What's fascinating in this book is that the usual dichotomy of Nazis and Allies is not in place. It concerns the life of a family in Germany that has been displaced from the East and is trying to carve out survival, I think, in the West of Germany. The book itself actually doesn't use these terms, East and West, but it concerns a family of 5 in which the father is a doctor and he is in a prison camp in Russia. They hope he's alive and trying to get back to them. And this family has just been assigned 2 rooms in the house of a widow. All their dishes and furniture are from her. She's grouchy but kind, and they're glad to have 2 whole rooms. What is it like to live in the aftermath of war? What's it like to live in the aftermath of defeat? What's interesting is that you care about them. You care about them surviving and building back and finding hope. The story concerns all the members of the family, but it eventually centers on Margot. Margot had a twin brother and a favorite Great Dane, and a wonderful animal, and they were both shot by a soldier. We're never told what kind of soldier shot her brother or the dog. It's kind of just mentioned, and she's every once in a while it's kind of mentioned and expressed that she's grieving over this, and there's this great loneliness in her. But the story is not concerned with blaming so much as it's concerned about recovery. I got to read to you a conversation between Margot's brother Matthias and his friend Dieter. The young men are on a work crew, a construction crew, and they're having a conversation about work and how hard it is. And Matthias says to Dieter, "Didn't you like being a soldier?" And Dieter responds, "When I think of the way they took us for a ride, I still feel as if I could smash everything in sight. Only smashing things never made anything any better. When I was 16, they sent me to ditch digging on the west wall, a sea of mud and enemy planes overhead. A rotten deal, and I knew it. At home, we never cared much for all the hiling and hurrahing." "Your folks too?" Matthias asked in amazement. "I always thought my folks were the only ones who weren't all out for the government. There was a while when I actually felt ashamed of them." And Dieter responds, "Better than having to feel ashamed now." The book is deeply concerned, especially through the perspective of Margot's experience. The book is deeply concerned with, well, how do we go on? How do we live now? How do we live with ourselves? How do we keep living? How do we build back? How do we have hope? How do we live through this? Can life be more than just drudgery? Is it even okay if I can flourish again? It's called The Ark by Margot Benery-Isbert, and I am so glad that it's back in print. It was reprinted by Purple House Press, and I can't believe that it was ever out of print. It is such a mature book, such a good book. Hey, on that note, kind of the post-war era in Europe, I meant to mention a picture book called A New Coat for Anna. When my children were really little, this was one of their favorite books to be read over and over again. It's written by Harriet Ziefert and illustrated by the marvelous Anita Lobel. And it's about how in the extremely deprived circumstances of post-war, I don't know if it's Germany or Poland, how the child's mother finds the resources by mostly trading. She finds the resources to get her daughter a new winter coat. It's all the steps involved. It's growing the wool on the sheep and shearing the sheep and carding it and spinning it and weaving it and then taking the fabric to the tailor and trading a teapot so that the tailor will make the daughter a coat. And at the end, they all share the first Christmas dinner they've had in years. All the people who contributed to the coat sit around the Christmas table. To be honest, when I was reading it to my children, I was kind of aware of the background of the war, but mostly for us, it was a book about making things and all that goes into the construction of a winter coat. So it was like it was a book about how to make, but it's a hugely pertinent book to understanding if you would be doing a study or if your child were interested in things related to World War II. And it would make a lovely companion picture book for The Ark. Now, I don't typically do this, but I actually have a short list of young adult fiction on World War II. For the sake of clarity, I think it's helpful to define how young adult fiction, again, is different from middle grade fiction. It is not necessarily a demarcation that says these books are at a higher level in terms of the quality of their writing. It's a demarcation that says the thematic content is more mature, more psychologically mature, such as violence might be more graphic. There might be more than just a kiss. Middle grade fiction might have a kiss or some hand-holding or a crush. In this case, there might be some more mature sexuality presented. I'll go into that in just a minute. They are psychologically more challenging, and young adult fiction will have more self-reflection by the main character. So on that note, I need to tell you about The Borrowed House, a novel by Hilda Van Stockum. I was familiar with Van Stockum from her Irish Tales. It's a trilogy that begins with The Cottage at Bantry Bay. Really fun, beautiful stories about families that are pretty happy. I mean, the kids are mischievous and it's pretty realistic, but The Borrowed House is a challenging and fairly dark story. It's very good, but it is not for anyone under 13. Van Stockum, who was from Holland, writes this story about Hitler's occupation of Holland. Van Stockum knew about the wartime suffering and courageous acts of her Dutch relatives. And this story concerns a girl named Jana Oster, whose parents are actors in Holland. She goes from Germany to join them in Holland. Just prior to joining her parents, she's memorizing Hitler's theories of racial supremacy. For her, it's totally abstract. She can't imagine the ultimate implications of these theories. She becomes warm and fast friends with someone and then discovers that they belong to this race that she was taught was inferior. It comes as a shock to her. Van Stockham's son writes, Jana is angry that the theories she was carefully taught conflict with her warm feelings for a real human being. Jana realizes she has to reject these theories because they're anti-human, but she also realizes that to reject them is to undergo great risk. And here's where we get to the young adult part of the book. So this book asks us to think about what are we willing to compromise on in order to maintain our safety, in order to go along with what's popular. Jana's mother is beautiful, and she's a beautiful actress. And the reason their family is doing so well is because a wealthy German officer, a baron in the Nazi army, an SS officer, has arranged for Jana's family to take over a house, thus the borrowed house, to occupy a house from a Dutch family. This Baron is in love with her mother, and her mother has feelings for the Baron, but does not want to go along with anything because obviously she's married and has a respect for the honor of her marriage. The Baron and Mrs. Auster are conflicted because they are living in an age where the old rules and old traditions don't matter anymore, especially if you're in a position of power. They share this magnificent borrowed house with another SS officer, a cruel man who has a really nasty son, but we realize that the kid is nasty because his dad is super abusive. This other SS officer holds gatherings in the house, yucky gatherings, in which Jana walks into one of them and is sort of forcibly kissed by an SS officer. These experiences of Jana's tear the mask off the putrescence of Hitler's ideologies and structures. There's a really good written review of The Borrowed House by Hilda van Stockum on Plumfield and Paideia. I appreciate the level of detail they give to this book. They too strongly suggest that this is a powerful book that leads to very important conversations with your teens. In the end, she and her mother and her family make the right decisions, but it's not a lighthearted book. It does end in hope, but it's a very complex book, worth reading together. The title Dawn of Fear by Susan Cooper is another. She's known more as the author of the Dark is Rising books, but Dawn of Fear is a World War II era book. Overall, it seems to me to be generally an anti-war book, and it concerns, in this particular village, two different groups of kids that fight each other for seemingly very little reason. All the while, also what's going on is some air raids. This book seems to conclude with the idea that war is simply senseless and it is simply bad. Perhaps it's a good book if your son is really enchanted by the idea of war. It does help bring some perspective. These two groups of boys who seem to fight each other, there's kind of this enjoyment of they literally make cannonballs out of mud and throw them at each other. The boys in this novel see war as something kind of exciting and adventurous until the end, where the reality of war becomes personal. So if you need a book to deglorify war without showing a lot of blood, this might be a good book to bring balance. And then finally, I cautiously recommend to your older children, I'd say 13 and up, a novel that I have reviewed extensively in its own podcast called The War That Saved My Life by Emily Brubaker Bradley. I cautiously recommend it because in the background of that book, or not so much of a background in the book, there's abuse of the main character. That's really dark, really troubling. There's abuse in the background of a book called Goodnight, Mr. Tom. I think it could be read by ages 10 and up. It concerns how a grouchy old man in the countryside takes care of a boy who is taken refuge with him from the London Blitz. Willie and Mr. Tom both bring healing and life to each other. And in closing, of course, I must share with you Corrie ten Boom's autobiographical work, The Hiding Place, for a total picture of hope regarding World War II and a first-hand account. There's hardly anything better. I spoke about the impact that this book had on me in terms of integrating my highest principles to my daily details in a podcast called Rules, Limits, and Other Liberating Things. What fascinates me about Ten Boom is just her life of integrity. So a really beautiful book in which she really is God is the protagonist of her story rather than the Nazis. Just a powerful book. Thank you for listening to this podcast. I really hope I have given you some worthy choices for you and for your children as you are seeking out good literature on World War II. I've attached a book list as a PDF in the show notes, so I hope that you are able to access that and enjoy that. Remember, we are sent out as sheep among wolves. Let us be as wise as serpents and as gentle as doves.